Kazuha is considered one of the best animo units in the game, and to some, one of the best characters in the game in general. This is largely due to his strong grouping capabilities, his good damage output, and his high team synergy capabilities. However, Kazuha has a few builds that he's generally swapped between, that being his main DPS slash sub DPS build, his full elemental mastery build, and the hybrid build between those two. And since Kazuha is one of my favorite characters and the only character that I have triple crowned, I wanted to go over each and every one of those builds and test them out myself. Hi, my name is Blossums, and today we're going to be going over each and every one of those builds and comparing and contrasting them to give you guys a visual representation for what you can generally expect from them, instead of you having to stare at like an Excel sheet or something. So with that said, of course, these builds aren't perfect, and I'm sure they could be better in one way or in another. So I just wanted to give that general disclaimer that nothing here is perfect, and this is mostly anecdotal evidence, but I still wanted to give you guys that visual representation to know what you can generally expect from these builds, so you can get an idea as to how you may want to build your very own Kazuha. So how's this all going to go down? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to test all three of those builds that I mentioned previously, the full DPS slash sub DPS, the full elemental mastery, or the kind of hybrid build between the two, but we're also going to be doing them twice. We're going to be swapping between two different weapons, and those two weapons are going to be the Iron Sting, which is a 4-star craftable weapon that is very easily accessible for him. It's going to be a refinement rank 5. This is the max potential Iron Sting here. But we're also going to be comparing that to something like the R1 Primordial Jade Cutter, which is a huge stat stick, gives us a ton of crit rate. And the reason we're doing these is because they both lend themselves a little bit better to different aspects of the build. So like the Primordial Jade Cutter is a little bit better on the DPS side, and then the of course the Iron Sting's a little bit better on the Elemental Mastery side type build. So we're going to be showing both of those extremes for all of the builds, just so you can kind of see the differences in the weapons to best make a decision for yourself. I don't have Freedom Sworn, which is kind of the tailor-made weapon for Kazuha when he released that came out with him. So unfortunately, we're not going to be able to show that, but these should cover the bases pretty darn effectively, because they're basically taking both of those ends of the spectrum and showing you how they operate on each and every one of those builds. We're also going to be pairing him with Bennett, and we're going to be using Bennett's Elemental Burst here. He's also going to be breaking the Cryo Regisvine's shield there, because we're just going to be dumping on the Cryo Regisvine, because of course we are. That's a test dummy. And we're going to have Skyward Blade on him at level 80 here. We're going to have him on the 4-piece Noblesse Oblige set, because that is typically what you're going to have Bennett on anyway. So he's going to be buffing up our Kazuha, and also because Bennett's Pyro, it's going to be a lot easier for testing, because Pyro takes precedence over the other elements whenever you're trying to swirl something. So that way it's just going to be a little bit easier for us when we're actually testing. Just to preface, I do have my Bennett at C5 here. I do have the Tragic C6, but I haven't activated it yet, and that's what we're going to be testing on. So Bennett's going to be at C5 here. And as I mentioned, he has the Noblesse Oblige set, and his stats are like so. He's at 1400 attack here. And then these are his general stats. These don't really matter too much, but I did want to show you guys just in case you were wondering, just so you have full context for the build. And I will be showing each and every one of the Kazuha builds that we're using, just so you guys know what we have going for our stats there. Before we start comparing and contrasting all the different numbers for the Iron Sting, I'm going to show off each of the stats on all of the Iron Sting builds, and then before we do the Jade Cutter stuff, I'll show all the stats for the Jade Cutter builds, and then after both of those, we'll compare and contrast all of them all together. So here's all the Iron Sting builds, starting with the DPS. Moving on to the hybrid. And lastly, the full elemental mastery build. Alright, and now that that's out of the way, we'll briefly show the Iron Sting builds, and then we'll go ahead and talk about all of the numbers. Alright, so briefly putting up all the numbers from our testing here, and do keep in mind that these are all the crit numbers. We didn't crit in some of those clips. I had to go back, make sure we got the correct numbers, and I put them up on the screen here for you to see briefly. And with that said, do remember that the EM isn't going to be critting nearly as often as the hybrid of the DPS, because you don't have a crit rate main stat or anything, or a crit rate on your weapon or anything. So this is definitely a little bit better for it in the raw damage than it should be showing here, and that is if you crit. So unless you have some cracked artifacts, this likely isn't going to be happening. But with these numbers, you do see that about what you would expect. The EM is best at supporting teammates by giving the most damage bonus and having the highest swirl. The DPS is the best at the raw damage, and the hybrid fits somewhere in between the two on them. You also notice the infusion damage for the E skill and the elemental burst are all pretty much the same. The EM edges out here a little bit because I do have a little bit of extra attack percent on our subsets there, and the infused damage does scale off of your attack there, so that's just there for reference. While playing with all these builds, I found that the full EM Iron Sting was probably my favorite, because 35.5% damage bonus is no joke. That is a ton. That's so much more than the hybrid version, just because you have so much EM. And it is really buffing your allies. It allows them to deal some incredible damage, and the passive from the Iron Sting is phenomenal for supporting your team as well and allowing you to just deal that little bit more extra damage. So the EM impressed me a lot. The other two were pretty good, and I do like them. And I think the DPS kind of surprised me more than anything, because you are still getting a solid damage bonus there while dealing some pretty decent damage, and I do like that. I also wanted to keep in mind that this is all in a Bennett circle as well, so these numbers are a little bit higher than you'll see in the wild, but typically you are going to have a damage bonus of some kind on your team comps there, so this is basically taking that to its logical extreme. And I really like the Iron Sting. If I'm trying to build a support-based Kazuha to help my other characters, I think I am going to be leaning towards the Iron Sting, but we'll talk more about that when we start comparing the Jade Cutter and the Iron Sting here. So let's go ahead and show off the Jade Cutter builds, and then show off the Jade Cutter gameplay, and we'll talk about those numbers as well. Alright, and now we'll start to show off the Jade Cutter builds here, and starting with the DPS version. And then the hybrid version. And then the full elemental mastery version. Alright, and now briefly looking at the Jade Cutter numbers, you'll see the raw damage here is definitely much higher here, especially for the DPS and the hybrid. The EM falls off quite a bit, and we'll talk about that reasoning in just a second here. But the burst damage is also higher, so our raw damage numbers are much higher. However, our swirl and damage bonus numbers are all lower, and that's because we are missing the substat from the Iron Sting. So as a support option, the Jade Cutter actually falls off a little bit, but you do gain the raw damage, so it kind of offsets itself there, which is nice. But the damage bonus you're giving your allies isn't nearly as much, especially on the DPS, where you're not even meeting 10%. And then the hybrid is going to the 16.5, which is close to what the DPS was for the DPS build for the Iron Sting was beforehand, which is pretty insane. And we're even missing quite a little bit on the Elemental Mastery build there. I believe it's 35.5 before, now it's 28.9. We're missing like a whole 7 there almost in the damage bonus there. So yeah, you're definitely trading off some stuff going for a more DPS oriented weapon. And for the DPS Kazuha, I think something like Jade Cutter is probably going to be the move here, where you are dealing that big raw damage. You just are indeed sacrificing that damage bonus. And for me personally, with the Jade Cutter, especially after testing and whatnot, and what I typically use for the Jade Cutter anyway is the hybrid build, because this, in my opinion, is the perfect middle ground. You're still dealing really solid raw damage, and you are still getting a solid damage bonus there at 16.5%, which is a whole 2-piece set there. And you are just very consistent dealing that raw damage to where, like, if you can't swirl what you want to, you're still dealing good damage, and you're still giving a good damage bonus to your allies. But For the EM for the Jade Cutter, I would not recommend it. I think the Iron Sting Elemental Mastery build is better than the Jade Cutter Elemental Mastery build, strictly because your swirl and your damage bonus is going to be better. However, I will say, because the Jade Cutter has such high crit rate, you will be critting more often and more consistently and reliably than you would be with an Iron Sting full EM build. So that damage does make a difference in total. That is certainly going to add up. I just think that the support capabilities of the Iron Sting are a little bit better, in my opinion, and the amount of damage that you could have with the Jade Cutter on a hybrid or DPS build rather than the EM build is just kind of outweighs the EM build, and that's because when you have the hybrid or DPS build, you can put on a crit damage helmet very easily with a Jade Cutter because you have so much crit rate, and that's why the E skill damage and the DPS damage E skill numbers were so much higher than the EM build numbers there. And this really exemplifies what I think Iron Sting and Jade Cutter lend themselves best to, where Iron Sting is just the best EM option, and the Jade Cutter is better for those raw damage numbers. However, I do, as I said, think the hybrid version for the Jade Cutter is going to be better than the DPS overall, at least in my opinion. You do lose a little bit of that raw damage, but your support capabilities are quite a bit heftier in my opinion. I think the swirl and the damage bonus you get from the hybrid version with the Jade Cutter is much better than the DPS version there for Kazuha. But do keep in mind that this is in a Bennett circle, and outside of a Bennett circle, and if you're not buffing Kazuha as much with your team comp, the DPS is going to be performing marginally better than the hybrid than in its current state, because you just have so much more attack than the hybrid version. But yeah, in conclusion, I think the Iron Sting is much better in that kind of supportive scenario, and then the Jade Cutter seems to be, at least in my opinion, much better in that hybrid version. You keep in mind, this was in a Bennett circle. You need to keep that in mind whenever you're looking at any of these numbers, because of course the hybrid is going to fall off quite a bit more when you're not buffing your Kazuha from like another character or anything, because you are going to hit a diminishing returns point on your attack there, and that's why the numbers are much closer in our testing there than they typically would be. So the hybrid is going to be dealing less damage outside of a buffing scenario, but as I said, in most team comps you are going to be buffing your Kazuha, so I think that's a little bit better of a representation, and I think the Jade Cutter is just better for that in that hybrid scenario. I like being able to support and deal some solid raw damage. And the Iron Sting, now I know, is going to be an amazing supportive option. 35.5% elemental damage bonus is no joke, and I can't wait to get it even higher with some better elemental mastery substats. But let me know if I changed your mind on how you're building your Kazuha, if this was useful to you, as I would like to see it in the comment section below. Let me know what you guys thought about all of this, how this video was built, because this video was definitely a learning experience for me. I got to try a lot of different editing stuff. It took me a good amount of time, and I'm glad I did it because I learned a lot of stuff along the way. But yeah, other than that, hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your day. Hope this helped you out. And yeah, my name is Blossoms, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.